One-time-strong Indo-Russian relations are now given a boost after a landmark visit by the Indian Prime Minister to Moscow. But what's behind the newly agreed economic partnership? Could it develop into a political alliance? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. While the US-India civil nuclear agreement continues to draw criticism in India, the country's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has struck a virtually no-strings-attached civil nuclear deal with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev during a three-day visit to Moscow. Prime Minister Singh assured the Russian leader that New Delhi regards Moscow as its most important partner and that India's relations with third countries will never be at the cost of their time-tested ties. Neve Barker has more on this partnership from Moscow.
It's an enduring friendship founded on major weapons deals, a relationship now set to strengthen in the sealing of a civil nuclear pact, a deal the Russian president stressed was in line with international regulations.
We're interested in having those defense capabilities, which are possessed by a number of states, including nuclear capabilities, under control, so that they don't fall hostage to radicals of all sorts, so that they are not used to start a large-scale conflict or even threaten their neighbors.
Russia is a major global power and a factor of peace and stability in the international system. India accords the highest priority to its relations with Russia. This is a relationship that stands on its own footing and is not influenced by our relations with any other countries.
Singh's wish list includes further investment from Moscow in India's nuclear power stations, along with an increase in uranium fuel imports to supply them, and for Russia to commit to sharing sensitive technology. Building on an arms deal agreed in October on an order for 80 Mi-17 helicopters, and to put pressure on Moscow to deliver a refurbished aircraft carrier, a delay that has somewhat soured relations. India signed a similar civil nuclear deal with the US in 2005, but delays have allowed Russia to bound ahead of its main rival, an indicator perhaps of India's preferred partner. Mr. Singh went on to meet Prime Minister Vladimir Putin.
Your visit has been successful. A lot of joint agreements were signed, and of course, that will surely be very good for the development of our future bilateral relations.
Economic and cultural relations date back to Soviet times and remain strong throughout the Cold War. Successive leaders have been keen to maintain old friendships. Russia, after all, is India's largest military partner. Both sides are currently in discussion over the creation of a new generation of supersonic fighter jets, along with the possibility of sending Indian astronauts into orbit on board Russian spacecraft. While joint military, engineering and scientific endeavours are quite literally taking off, comparatively trade between Russia and India lags behind that of the European Union and China. But as India's energy companies look for a growing stake in Russia's vast oil and gas reserves, it's likely to increase competition between India and China, with Russia in the middle. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Joining me on today's programme are my guests in New Delhi, Arun Mohanty, Professor of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and an expert in India-Russian relations. In Moscow, Dmitry Babich, political analyst at Russia Profile magazine. And in Washington, D.C., Ariel Cohen from the political think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Professor Mohanty, can I start with you in New Delhi? I mean, Russia was one of the first nations to formally recognise India when the country gained independence from the British in 1947. There were ideas of self-reliance and self-sustainability, perhaps areas of common ground between the two countries. How important have those ideas been in the past 6 decades between the two countries?
It has been very, very significant in developing independent India, in developing a self-reliant economy in India. But I must tell you one historical fact. Before we approached Soviet Union, when we went for rapid industrialization of India, we had approached the Western countries. But when the Western countries refused to give us that assistance, we approached Moscow, and we got that assistance in building India's infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, many enterprises in energy, steel, many more sectors. So in the first 3 decades, starting from 55, there are almost 120 industrial enterprises built with Soviet assistance. More than that, of course, we have very meaningful defense cooperation, we have very meaningful cooperation in science and technology, and of course in culture and other areas.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, how important has this relationship been over the past 6 decades, considering that the Russian Federation as it is now was formerly the Soviet Union and India stood by and watched as the Soviet Union collapsed?
Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, there was a temporary pause in relationship because Russia was dealing with its own interior problems. And there were some problems with servicing India's debt to Russia because rupee was not fully convertible, as far as I remember. But after the Russian economy recovered after the 90s, the dialogue resumed, and actually military supplies never ended. They continued even during the 90s. So India was a real savior for our military-industrial complex. Since there was an unofficial ban on Russia's arms exports to NATO countries, with a few exceptions, we could only supply weapons to India and China. These were 2 preferred destinations.
Ariel Cohen in Washington. I suppose to understand the present, we have to understand the past and how influential the Cold War was in that relationship between Russia and India. And before we even carry on with the rest of this programme, and how the position of those 2 countries changed in the attitude towards Western nations, because both, you might say, have taken different tacks and different roads since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Indeed, the Soviet model was appealing to the Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi generation. And even now, when you visit India, you see a gap between people in their 60s who have fond memories of the close relationship between New Delhi and the Soviet Moscow, and the younger generation who are looking globally to the great economic partnership, especially in high tech, between India and the United States. There are a lot of Indians in the Silicon Valley. But today, just as in the previous century, the geopolitics are very, very important to Indian foreign policy. And Moscow is an important component, especially when you look at Afghanistan. India does not want, neither does Moscow, the victory for the Taliban or the Pakistani ISI in Afghanistan. India is also very concerned about the rise of China. And here, India has to play Moscow and the United States, because otherwise China will be totally unchecked. So there is a mutual interest for Russia and for India to renew and develop the relationship that now stands on 2 legs. One is military and one is nuclear.
Well, we'll bring in the China and the Afghan issues just slightly later in the programme, but you certainly touched on points that we will be addressing. Professor Mohanty in New Delhi, if we just come back to this week's visit by the Indian Prime Minister to Moscow, I mean, it does pave the way now for these 2 emerging economies as part of the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China group, to move their economies and their political agendas forward. That was helped last year by the US-India civilian nuclear deal. Why do you think this particular deal hasn't raised as many eyebrows, perhaps in India?
Tell you very frankly, we thought perhaps with the help of United States, India would get a very clean waiver from the NSG, so that there would be nuclear commerce for India, and there won't be any restrictions with India's civil nuclear commerce with the rest of the world. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. United States did facilitate our access to the nuclear commerce. That is true. But afterwards, in G8 meeting held in Italy, once again, US started speaking about restrictions on supplies of nuclear fuel, then technologies unless India signs NPT. And India is no way thinking of signing NPT. So that is the reason India is not exactly very happy, and we have signed an agreement with the US, which is called 123 agreement, which envisages these restrictions on supply of high-tech, supply of technologies, enrichment equipments, and reprocessing equipments. So, but nevertheless, both countries are engaged in some kind of talks, and we are waiting for the result of those talks, whether there will be restrictions or no restrictions in supplying those nuclear technology, high-tech equipments, reprocessing equipments to India from United States.
Ariel Cohen in Washington, what sort of reaction is there within the Politico, you might say, in the United States to this deal between India and Russia?
Unfortunately, the United States is, I believe personally, misled by trying to impose these NPT restrictions on the countries like India or like Israel that have vital national interest to protect their security from the neighbors which are either having strong nuclear programs like Pakistan or China for that matter, or were threatened to be wiped out off the map, like Israel was threatened by Iran. Therefore, the United States, I believe, may be shooting itself in the foot by trying to impose the restrictions and ceding nuclear business to Russia, whereas the Russian nuclear industry is very strong, very competitive, and at times maybe beating down the United States nuclear industry. So I think it would be foolish for the US to cede the important Indian market to competition, be it the French, who also have a very strong nuclear industry and will be delighted to sell equipment to India or to the Russians.
Of course. Dmitry Babich in Moscow. I suppose it has to be said that had the US nuclear deal not happened in July 2008 with India, then perhaps Russia wouldn't be in this particular position right now. So it has been quite an important deal in terms of a development for Russia.
Yes, and basically Russian leadership is very pragmatic in its foreign relations. Russia, sells anything it can sell legally to any country. And India is a responsible country, it's a democracy. So obviously our Prime Minister and our President do not see any problem in cooperating with India in the nuclear field. By the way, NPT, it doesn't prohibit peaceful nuclear cooperation among countries. In fact, it even endorses it. So I don't see any problem in Russia's cooperating with India in the nuclear field.
Well, moving from nuclear, let's go to the economy now. And Professor Mohanty, it has to be said that India needs to find new ways to find the energy to keep its manufacturing industrial sector moving and progressing. Analysts are saying that within the next 40 years, India will need 100 times more the energy that it's producing at this present moment in time. So how important is India as an economic partner then to Russia?
Indian economy is maintaining a growth rate of over 7%, and perhaps Indian economy would be able to maintain this growth rate in future. So obviously the economy would require a lot of energy. So India is contemplating a kind of energy security program. So India and Russia are natural partners in this field, because Russia has a huge source of gas and oil, and India is a very large consumer country. So this makes us natural partners in the field of energy. So starting from independence, Russia, the former Soviet Union, has been helping us in building our power generation industry. Then afterwards, we developed our cooperation in the nuclear fields. According to Indian plan, right now the share of nuclear energy in India's energy balance is just 3.5%, but we would like this share to grow up to 20% in next 25, 30 years. So that means India is going to build some 30, 40 reactors over next few decades. Here again, so Russia is going to be our important partner, because Russia became the first country which has signed an agreement with us without any restriction. Then the next field is, of course, oil and gas. We have invested $2.7 billion in Sakhalin oil and gas fields. Then we have purchased a company, Imperial Energy, which is working in Russia for $2.58 billion. And as a result of this current summit at Moscow, we have hope that we will have access to Sakhalin 3 project, which is a very, very massive project. Sure. And if foreign participation is allowed, perhaps we will have some stakes there. Then we can have some access to Pechora region energy sources too.
Indeed, the economic development and certainly investment is there for all to see. And certainly Russia wants a piece of the action, as do the Americans, as do the French. It's just been mentioned by our Washington guest. Dmitry Babich, would it be correct to say, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but put it into context for us, that Russia, as a historical senior partner in the relationship, has had to change its attitude towards India on the basis of India's development in the wider world and how it is perceived by those countries that want to do business with it now that maybe didn't consider doing business with it about 20 years ago?
Well, Russia's relations with India have been very good since the establishment of India's independence. And in the last few years, there were some changes in Russia's relations to India's neighbors. We improved our relations with Pakistan because there is no more such irritant in our relations as Afghanistan was during the 80s. We also improved our relations with China in the last 2 decades. So basically, India is one of the few directions of Russia's foreign policy where we don't meet any jealousy from the United States or from the European Union or from any other country. So it's a relatively conflict-free area for us.
Let's move on then to slightly economy meeting politics then. Ariel Cohen, on the economy front, Russia has been a strong supporter of allowing or wanting to see India as part of the G20 and institutionalising and cementing that relationship within the group. These steps do bring India into a unique club, and therefore India politically needs countries like Russia and the United States on side.
Absolutely, and the Indians, I think, were playing it brilliantly by not committing to an alliance with any of the major poles, if you wish, of the modern world. They're with the West, they're a democracy. They have probably more English speakers than the United Kingdom, but at the same time they have good relations with Russia, and they have a double threat. In the long term, not an immediate threat, but a double threat in the long term. One is from destabilization or disintegration of Pakistan and the loss of control over Pakistani nukes. And the other is that with all the successes of the Indian economic growth, China is growing even faster. And China has a more coherent national leadership and more coherent developmental policies. So in the long run, China may be a greater economic power than India, maybe a greater military power, and the Indians, while having fought a war with China in the 1960s, but improved the relations very much right now, still have some long-term geopolitical unease when looking at Beijing, and therefore they have to play this balancing game with Moscow, with Washington, with Beijing, and with the Muslim world.
Well, Professor Mohanty, let's talk about some of the politics and sort of the geopolitics of the area. Behind the scenes, there are other issues that both the President Medvedev and Prime Minister Singh must have talked about, one of them being terrorism. The Mumbai attacks have just seen their first anniversary pass by, and just recently, in the past fortnight, we've seen the Nevsky train bombing in Russia. One wonders how India and Russia can help each other to fight terrorism when they also both have an interest in what goes on in Afghanistan because of their strategic locations?
You know, both India and Russia are victims of cross-border terrorism, international terrorism. So we have a common interest to tackle this issue. And to tackle this issue, we have two mechanisms. One is the joint working group on combating international terrorism. Then the other one is the Indo-Russian working group on Afghanistan. So these are the mechanisms through which we are trying to tackle the issues of terrorism emanating from our neighborhood, Afghanistan, then the spillover effect of Afghanistan in India and in Central Asia. So we have a very meaningful dialogue, cooperation in this area, and the result of this particular summit is that we will go for greater information sharing to tackle terrorism emanating from our neighborhood. And I would like to just remind that, you know, President Medvedev was the first head of a state who visited India in the aftermath of Bombay terrorist attacks. So, and at that time, of course, we once again discussed these issues, how to tackle terrorism, which really poses a very, very grave danger to both our countries.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, I mean, both countries do have a history connected to Afghanistan. India currently helping to build its parliament building and lots of the road infrastructure. And Russia giving NATO supply routes via land routes into the country. I mean, how important is influence then in that part of the world as far as Moscow is concerned?
Russia's and India's views on Afghanistan coincided during most of the recent history. In fact, I can remind you that when Russia abandoned Najibullah's government in Afghanistan in 1991-1992, India was not happy about this, and there were even rumors about India trying to help this government until it was toppled by the Mujahideen rebels in 1992, unfortunately. And basically, Russia would like to do more in Afghanistan. We have a lot of experience there, but we don't have many supporters in Hamid Karzai's government in Afghanistan, and we have some people in the West who are very sensitive about Russia's presence in Afghanistan. In fact, Russia has built a lot of projects in Afghanistan.
It seems that Mr. Cohen wants to come in there.
I think the Russian experience...
Mr. Cohen.
Unfortunately, Russian experience, Soviet experience, not Russian experience. Soviet experience in Afghanistan was quite negative, and there's still a lot of residual resentment of what the Soviet Union has done in Afghanistan, generating a 2+ million refugees that poured into Pakistan and then triggering a 10-year long war. But having said that, the mess today in Afghanistan is so bad that there are some reports that even Najibullah that you mentioned and the Soviet presence are mentioned in a more positive way than in the past. Sure. But looking into the future...
That's exactly what I wanted to say.
Neither India, nor Russia, nor the United States, nor Western Europe want the Taliban to topple the current government and to start spreading the kind of radicalism and terrorism that we've seen in the second half of the 1990s.
And therefore,
so
I suppose,
uniquely, you can say.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I suppose therefore, that's why most probably Russia and India will have to work together to make sure that doesn't happen to a certain extent, along with the NATO allies. There, I'm afraid, gentlemen, we do have to leave. It's a very interesting topic when we come to talk about Russia-India relations, and I'm sure we will return to it again on this edition of Inside Story. To my guests in New Delhi, Moscow and Washington, thank you very much. And thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time and your company.